I'm Richard Baldwin, and I'd like to welcome you to this CTI webinar, research webinar, where we are a series of webinars where we're presenting research that's sort of ongoing, preliminary, with the hope that we can get some feedback on how to make it better, how to continue it forward, and just general reflections. So today we're going to have a paper on openness, innovation, and firm performance. This is related to a National Science Foundation grant that we're running at CTI. And the author is with us. Let me see if I can actually see her on the screen. Yes. Anmol is a PhD student here at the Graduate Institute, working with me and Julia Kaya. I don't know what's with me today. I can't pronounce any names. And without any further ado, I'll just turn it over to her. I wanted to say one thing is that basically the idea of this paper is to investigate the firm level dynamics of openness, innovation, and firm performance. That's the basic idea. Now, it's well understood that innovation is key to raising productivity of firms. And what this is really trying to do is tease out the interaction between openness. Now, the results are pretty preliminary. And I should add, this is all focused on developing countries. In developed countries, the literature is significantly more advanced. So here, the idea is, if you are going to, the key results are that innovation spending or innovation efforts in developing countries work best when countries and firms in those developing countries are networked or connected with international companies. So that if there is a policy takeaway when we're done with this, it'll be that if you want to leverage the expenditure, the resources, the energy that's being put into innovation in developing countries, those policies should be teamed together with policies that encourage linkages with foreign firms, because frequently that foreign firms are sort of a pipeline for new knowledge. Okay, so please use the Q&A function or the chat box for your question. Anmol is going to be making a presentation, not too short, not too long, because we want to leave lots and lots of time for questions and answers. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Anmol, please.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, everyone. My name is Anmol. I'm a second-year PhD student here at the Graduate Institute. And today I'll be presenting to you an ongoing paper that we have undertaken with the support of the Swiss National Science Foundation. And the title of the paper is Openness, Innovation, and Firm Performance. And we use evidence from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. I will just share my screen. Michael, could you confirm if you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see it perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I'll be summarizing the paper so far and talking about the baseline findings. And it would be great to get your feedback and comments on that. And please feel free to use the chat box or write to Michael with any questions or comments that you may have. So in this paper, the objective of this paper is to investigate firm level dynamics of openness, innovation, and firm performance. I'll get into the details of what I mean by openness, but broadly, it refers to foreign linkages in the form of exports, imports, FDI, or the use of foreign licensed technology. The empirical strategy of this paper will be to estimate an augmented version of a structural framework that was originally proposed by Crepon, Duguay, and Maires in 1998. And I'll talk a little bit about that in detail a little later. The data for this paper comes from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, and I use that to construct a panel data set spanning 27 countries, predominantly developing and emerging countries, between the years 2008 and 2017. With this paper, we aim to advance the understanding on how developing countries can maximize their gains from openness, in particular, how openness would influence their decisions to innovate and how that might translate into firm performance. Our baseline findings suggest that firms that have foreign linkages in one of those 4 ways that I mentioned are more likely to invest in research and development and generate a greater innovation output in the form of product or process innovation. So to recap the research question for you, the central research question of this paper is, how does openness affect firm level decisions to innovate and in turn their firm performance? For this purpose, I'll be using 4 measures of openness. One is share of exports. Second is whether the firm uses imported foreign inputs. Second, whether it has more than 10% of foreign ownership, which is inward FDI. And third, whether it uses foreign licensed technology. And in terms of innovation, my definition consists of 2 different types of innovation. One, which is product innovation, which refers to any new or significantly improved product launched by the firm in the last 3 years, whereas process innovation refers to any new or significantly improved process, which might involve the manufacturing process, the marketing, or the delivery. And any of this innovation, if it was carried out in the last 3 years, then we would say that the firm is a process innovator. So the reason why I choose to do this analysis at the firm level is because decisions to undertake innovation take place at the firm level and not at the more aggregate level that we are used to studying, such as this country or the industry level. And secondly, using the firm level data allows us to capture unobserved firm level heterogeneity, which may go unaccounted for in the case of more aggregate analysis, but using firm level data allows us to account for that. And this is crucial because these unobserved heterogeneities may be very significant in explaining the productivity differences across firms. Second, the reason why we focus on developing countries in this paper is because the empirical literature on developing countries in this context of research is quite scant. And the reason for this is that innovation surveys are an extremely costly exercise. So they're costly to do already in developed countries, and it makes it even more costlier to do them in developing countries because you have to go and do them in person. The lack of infrastructure doesn't allow you to carry out these surveys online or through automated processes. So developing countries lack wide-scale innovation data because these surveys are so costly and hard to implement. Second, the nature of innovation in developing countries is quite different from that of developed countries. While the literature on developed countries is definitely more established, it's not the case for developing countries. And this is important because innovation in developing countries is less radical and more incremental as compared to the one in developed countries. And that's why it's harder to monitor and report. So this again brings us to the point of missing data or incomplete data, or the lack of harmonized comparable data across many countries for these innovation related variables that we're interested in, which is why I use the World Bank Enterprise Survey, which is a massive undertaking by the World Bank. They carry out these surveys in more than 143 countries, and they interview the same firms over time, which gives us an added panel dimension to the data set, which will be crucial in the later stages when we want to make causal inferences from our analysis. I'll quickly talk about the theoretical motivation on how openness may affect firm performance. There's an abundant literature on how the openness may affect firm performance. This may be through improved access to a greater variety or better quality of inputs, or through the imports of disembodied technology in the form of licenses or patents. And this is especially important when innovation takes the form of imitation or reverse engineering in the case of developing countries. And innovation may also improve the efficiency with which resources are utilized, thereby resulting in increases in productivity at the firm level. In terms of the empirical literature, this project builds upon the knowledge production function approach, which was originally proposed by Pakes and Grewal in 1980. Under this approach, Innovation inputs determine innovation outputs, which then in turn affect productivity. Based on this knowledge production function approach, Crépin, Duguay, and Maires in 1998 came up with a structural model using survey data for French firms in which they explained productivity by innovation output, which was in turn explained by research investment. And since this framework came about, a lot of empirical studies have been carried out which corroborate a positive correlation between R&D, innovation, and productivity. But the vast majority of these studies, these empirical studies, are either country specific, or if they do carry out cross-sectional, cross-country analysis, then they don't have a time dimension and they simply use cross-section data, which makes causal inferences a little harder to infer. In terms of the papers that this current paper is directly related to, one of which is Sietschlag and Zhang. They use innovation survey data for Ireland, and they showed that firms that engaged in international activities are more likely to invest in innovation, more likely to produce innovation outputs, and they also tend to have higher labor productivity. And my paper goes beyond Sietschlag and Zhang's because it carries out a cross-country analysis using panel data. And in turn, I expand my definition of foreign linkages or openness by also including the use of imported inputs and also the use of foreign licensed technology, both of which can have benefits and spillovers for innovation in developing countries. Another paper that is closely related to the one I'm presenting today is by Castellani and Zanfei. They used Italian firm level data, and they showed that manufacturing firms abroad tend to have higher productivity premia and the highest R&D efforts and innovation performance. But they didn't take into account, again, they had a cross-section data and they didn't have the panel dimension, which ignores the firm level unobserved heterogeneity and makes it difficult to interpret their findings as being driven by causation. And finally, Morris in 2018 also estimated a similar CDM model using the World Bank Enterprise Survey data. However, he did not account for the role of openness in influencing a firm's decision to invest, and then the intensity of that R&D investment, which my paper takes into account, as you'll see. So I'll quickly explain the theoretical framework, but I won't go into too much detail. We can come back to it if needed. So following the Crépin, Duguay, and Maires framework that I just described, firm behavior is modeled in 3 stages. In the first stage, firms decide whether they want to invest in R&D activities or not, and how much to invest. This consists of the innovation input. In the second stage, they produce knowledge, which is the innovation output, as a result of the investment that they took in the first stage. And in the final stage, output is produced using the innovation output, which may be the product or the process innovation from the second stage, along with any other inputs that the firm may use. So these 3 stages can be modeled in the form of the following equations. In the first equation, we have YIT star as the dependent variable, and the reason why it's marked with an asterisk is because it's a latent variable that captures the predicted utility from investing in R&D. X1 is simply referring to covariates at the firm level, so characteristics of the firm that may influence the decision to invest. This may be firm size, human capital, access to credit, openness, which is one of the key variables of interest for us. Mu t is simply time fixed effects, and epsilon it is the error term. So the reason why I said that the predicted utility from investing in innovation is latent or hidden is because R&D investment is really hard to monitor. It may be that a firm shows 0 R&D investment as long as its investment in R&D was below a certain threshold. So because we only observe the values that are reported, And because there might be this selection issue of firms not reporting their R&D investments unless they're exceeding a certain threshold, we might end up with too many zeros in that variable. So we might end up with too many firms saying that they don't invest, whereas they might be investing, albeit a smaller amount, less than that threshold. So in order to remedy this selection issue, we have the selection equation in equation 2, where YIT is a dummy variable that captures the decision of the firm to invest, which takes the value 1 if the latent predicted utility from investing exceeds a certain threshold, which is C, and it takes the value 0 if it falls below that, threshold, which is C. So conditional on the firm investing in R&D, we have the third equation, which describes WIT as a function of the hidden predicted utility from investing. And WIT here is the actual innovation effort exerted. So it's the R&D expenditure per worker, the log of the R&D expenditure per worker, which takes the value of the predicted utility from investing YIT star in case the firm does invest, and it takes the value 0 in case the firm doesn't invest. And assuming that the error terms in the previous equations are bivariate normals with 0 mean and variance is equal to 1, we can estimate equations 2 and 3 using the Heckman two-step procedure. Once we estimate equations 2 and 3 from the Heckman procedure, we can model the second stage of the firm's behavior using the knowledge production function in equation 4, where WIT star bar is the predicted intensity of R&D expenditure predicted from equations 2 and 3. X3 is a set of firm level characteristics, and ZIT is the innovation output. So it's the dummy that may take the value 1 if the firm has a product or a process innovation and 0 otherwise. And finally, we can use the predicted value of innovation output, that is ZIT bar, to estimate the impact of innovation output on firm productivity as shown in equation 5. And we'll do that in the form of an augmented Cobb-Douglas production function, where pi IT is the labor productivity for the firm, which is log sales per worker. X4 is again a set of firm level characteristics. And then we have the time fixed and firm fixed effects. So to recap, this model is estimated as a sequential system of equations going from equations 2, 3, 4, and 5. First, we estimate equations 2 and 3 using the Heckman two-step procedure. Then we use the predicted values of the innovation effort, which is R&D expenditure per worker, to estimate equation 4 using a probit. And the reason why we use a probit here is because ZIT is a dummy variable that takes value 1 in case of a product or a process innovation and 0 otherwise. And finally, using the predicted innovation output from equation 4, we use that to instrument for knowledge output in equation 5 and estimate the relationship between labor productivity and innovation output using a two-stage least square estimation. So this wraps up the theoretical framework according to which we'll run the empirics. So in order for us to have an identification strategy, it's important to have an exclusion restriction for the first stage equations in 2 and 3, which means that we need to have a variable that affects the decision to invest, but not the intensity of that R&D investment. And the literature has converged on firm size as one such variable to be used as an exclusion restriction. And the reason for this is that it's been established that conditional on investing in innovation, large firms do not necessarily proportionately invest more. So large firms are more likely to invest, but not proportionately more according to their size. So we can use that as an exclusion restriction for the first stage. And similarly, we also need an exclusion restriction for the second stage. So we need a variable that affects the innovation output, but not the productivity. And for that, we use the years of experience of the top manager at the firm. So I'll recap the data a little bit. The data is available for 146,000 firms in 143 countries. However, for the sake of the research question that we are investigating, the sample is restricted because I include only the countries in which firms were surveyed at least twice, and only those countries in which the innovation component of the survey was carried out. And as a result, I end up with a panel data set spanning 27 countries from the years 2008 to 2017. And I'm going to skip the variables because you'll see them in the tables. And I'll come back to this later. So here are the summary statistics. As you can see, we have the most number of observations for variables such as product innovation or the age of the firm or the size of the firm, whereas very limited observations on variables that are much harder to report and monitor. For example, the log R&D expenditure per worker, or just variables where the question wasn't asked in enough iterations of the survey. So fewer firms answered that question, for example, whether they have internet access or not. So table 2 presents the results from stage 1 of the model that I just explained. So we are regressing. We're carrying out the two-step Heckman procedure, where the first column, where the dependent variable is the decision to invest, it is explained by a number of firm level characteristics, and also characteristics that fall under the openness definition that I explained. As you can see, older firms are more likely to invest. Firms with a higher human capital are more likely to invest. And human capital here is described as the proportion of workers in the firm that have a university or a bachelor's level degree. It's important to note that firms that receive more than 10% of FDI or have more than 10% of foreign ownership are less likely to invest in R&D. And this may be because they don't carry out that investment on their own, and they simply use the innovations that come from their FDI channel. And again, for exporter, which is another one of our openness definition, we see that being an exporter raises the likelihood of the firm to invest in innovation. And so most of these are significant and do have a role in explaining the decision to invest. And then we carry out the second step of the two-step Heckman. And you should note that we don't use size in the second estimation, and that's because size is our exclusion restriction. And we operate under the assumption that size is correlated with the decision to invest, but not with the intensity of that investment. And once we've got the predicted value of R&D intensity from the first stage, we can carry out the determinants of, we can carry out the analysis of determinants of innovation output, and we do that using a probit. And the reason we use a probit is because the dependent variable is the binary variable, which is product innovation in column 1 and process innovation in column 2. And from these findings, we find that R&D intensity and the size of the firm and line of credit, these are the key variables that explain whether a firm would end up innovating on the product side or the process side. It's also worth noting that foreign licensed technology seems to be associated with only product innovation and not so much with process innovation. And the same goes for the firm being an exporter. Being an importer has a positive correlation with both the product innovation and process innovation. So combining the results from table 2 and 3, we can say that openness or stronger foreign linkages in the form of exports, imports, FDI, or the use of foreign licensed technology are linked with better performance of the innovation output in the form of either product innovation or process innovation by the firm. And so that wraps up the results we have. And in terms of the extensions, it may be interesting to look at the intensive margin of exporting and importing firms. So to see whether exporting more or importing more inputs, how that affects innovation, and not just using it as a dummy variable like we did as of now. And it may also be interesting to look at the regressions by country to allow for different mechanisms across countries, or to do it region-wise, because Latin American countries may have some similarities different from the others. And just a couple of concluding remarks. So this paper contributes to the existing literature by constructing a panel data set with harmonized survey data focusing on innovation variables covering 27 developing and emerging economies. And there's a policy relevance for developing countries in maximizing their gains from openness by improving linkages with foreign firms, either by exporting, importing, soliciting FDI, or using foreign licensed technology, since that results in higher innovation output. The second part of this paper will focus on studying the relationship on how this higher innovation output is associated with changes in productivity. And for that, I'll use labor productivity from the data set, as well as Oli and Pakis's TFP measures. But that's yet to be done. So that's another extension to pursue. And thank you. That's about it. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Anmol. If I can break the ice a little bit, I think there a couple of questions have come to you through the Q&A, and maybe some more will come. But I wanted to ask first about the connection between technological transfer and the trade. So there's a very old literature by Kaur and Helpman which showed that who you traded with affected, or actually it was an assumption, but that was back in the day when we made assumptions into empirical results. They were trying to argue that if you traded with high-tech countries or had relationships with high-tech countries, you would get more technology out of it. And that's one of the things you're exploring. But I wonder if the sort of direction of trade, which partners you're connected with, would make any difference at all, or you can't look at that.
I'm sorry, Professor, could you repeat the last bit of your question, please?
Sure. So the basic idea is that foreign involvement helps with the technology transfer, but not all foreign countries have the same level of technology.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you find a sort of bigger, is that something you can investigate, that, for example, if you're dealing with Germany, you get more of a bang than if you're dealing with, say, Greece?
Right. So given the existing World Bank Enterprise database, we can't, because there's no data on who the firms are trading with. We just know that they're exporters. We don't know to which countries, but this may be possible to do on a smaller sample of countries where we have more micro level data on firms, and we know exactly to which countries they're trading. And I think this should be easy to do, since if we want to look at more high-tech countries' involvement with lower tech countries, then there is better data available for that. Whereas if we were looking at developing countries trade with other developing countries, that data would be much harder to come across.
Right. Another idea, this might be kind of old-fashioned, but you don't know who the firms are trading with, but you know who the countries are trading with. And with many of these countries, the trade pattern is very stark. For example, a lot of the Latin American and Central American countries, they trade very largely with the United States, and that's about it, maybe a bit with Canada. And similarly, you might be able to take macro level data as a kind of instrument for who they are actually trading with, and do it that way, even with the World Bank data set. What would you think about that?
Yeah, that's doable. But the assumption is not so far-fetched that knowing the country trading profile, we apply the same trading profile to the firm. So that's doable as an extension.
Yeah. Okay.
I have some questions here. We have a question from Tamara asking if the paper result in any policy recommendations for the government, bearing in mind your findings. Well, yes, since we see a positive relationship between exporting and the use of foreign licensed technology for product innovation, it would be recommended that policies that are aimed to spur innovation at the domestic developing country level should be formulated in sync with policies that incentivize firms to then strengthen foreign linkages, because they go hand in hand, as our findings show. And do you see a relationship between how much the R&D investment should be versus, for example, the revenue of the company? So as I pointed out, R&D investment is very hard to capture, because it may be zero if the latent variable falls below a certain threshold. That's why we have so many missing values for this specific variable. But we do get the predicted value of R&D investment using the Heckman selection procedure that I explained. So it can be assessed from that predicted value that we get from the Heckman stage. We can compare that with the revenue of the company and see whether there's a certain threshold above which the R&D should be for it to have these positive associations with openness, for example, or productivity. Yes, there's another question. Should the R&D investment come from the public sector or the companies themselves? So given the questionnaire that was asked in the World Bank Enterprise data, we rely on the R&D investment done directly by the firm to explain any changes in innovation output or firm performance. But we may be able to take into account any support from the public sector. So any government incentives or any government programs that the firm may avail to have better access to public funding that can then be channeled towards investment in R&D. So that can be looked at. There's a couple of other comments. Just give me a minute. Okay, I'll just share this comment by Anders Arrow from ITC. They have a related working paper that has just been published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Economics. And they use ITC's Connect, Compete, Change framework to understand enterprise competitiveness. And they found that gains from integration into value chains are greater for small firms than for larger firms. And they've shared the link. So if anyone's interested, we'll be happy to pass it along, or you can get in touch with Anders Arrow directly. Thank you. Thank you for that, Anders.
And let me point out that that's one of my other students who did that one, Olga.
I guess we have a pattern here. We had received a question earlier before the webinar asking about any implications for least developed countries based on our findings. But given that we don't have least developed countries in the World Bank Enterprise Surveys and the resulting data set that I use, our findings would not directly translate to those, especially because the data is so limited for least developed countries. So I would not venture so far as to apply our findings to them.
Good.
I think that wraps up all the questions that we have.
Well, Anmol, there was a question about public versus private R&D spending. Can you distinguish that in the database?
We can't distinguish between public investments in R&D, but we do have a variable for whether the firm received any government support for training related activities, not exactly for innovation, but for training. So then that could feed again into the human capital variable that we used. I think that wraps up all the questions. If anyone's interested in getting a draft of the paper, please get in touch with Michael or with me. My email ID is anmol.grewal@graduateinstitute.ch. And thank you again for joining, everybody. And this was I'm really happy to receive the feedback that we did. Thank you.